Shavua Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Nazir. We are up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Dalet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Ranbayev, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, and Sason ben Raya, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen, and Avdi ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, betoch shar chulei Israel. Hareni Nazir me'ayom, if someone said, I'm hereby Nazir for 100 days, nitma yom me'an, he became tameh on the 100th day, soteret hakol, he forfeits all 100 days of his Nazirut. Now the next Tana disagrees. Rabbi Eliezer says, eno soter l'shloshim, he forfeits only 30 days of his Nazirut. According to Rabbi Eliezer, although a Nazir became tameh during his term, forfeits all the previous days, if he became tameh on the very last day of his term, he must repeat only 30 days no matter how long his term was. Rabbi Eliezer learns this from a verse in Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 13. The verse states, and this is the law of a Nazir on the day he completes his days of Nazirut. Rabbi Eliezer understands the verse to be teaching that on the day he completes his Nazirut, he is subject to the law of a Nazir, meaning should he become tameh on that final day, he forfeits only the 30 days of his standard Nazirut, regardless of the length of term he actually accepted upon himself. Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the first time in a case where the term was only for 30 days. In this case, repeating 30 days and repeating the entire term come to the same thing, and that is why Rabbi Eliezer did not argue in the last case of the previous Mishnah. The Mishnah cites another dispute between the first Tana and Rabbi Eliezer concerning a Nazir who became tameh on the day after his term ended. Nitma yom mea ve'echad, if the Nazir became tameh on the 101st day before he shaved and brought his offerings, soter shloshim yom, he forfeits 30 days of his Nazirut, even though he became tameh only after his term was over, and under biblical law, he does not forfeit any days. The rabbis decreed that he must observe another 30 days. The rabbis were concerned that if a person did not forfeit 30 days when he became tameh on the day after his Nazirut term, in our case the 101st day, people might confuse that day with the final day of his term, the 100th day, and think that the same is true when Nazir becomes tameh on the final day as well. They might think this because it is acceptable for a Nazir who is tahor to shave and bring offerings on the final day, like we learned in Mishnah 1. The rabbis therefore decreed that a Nazir should forfeit some of his Nazirut, even if he became tameh on the day after his term ended. Nevertheless, they did not decree that he forfeit his entire Nazirut. Rather, they ruled that he forfeit only 30 days of Nazirut, which is the same amount of days as a standard term of Nazirut. Now the Mishnah chooses 100 days simply as an example. The same law applies to any term of Nazirut over 30 days. And since in this case Nazirut is not forfeited by biblical law, the Nazir does not shave and bring the offerings of a Nazir who became tameh. Rather, he goes through the 7-day purification process and immediately observes 30 more days of Nazirut. Rabbi Eliezer but Rabbi Eliezer says, and also Shiva, he forfeits only 7 days during which he purifies himself from his tumah. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the rabbis never decreed that he forfeits any days in this case. Rather, he must simply remain on Nazir for 7 more days while he purifies himself from his tumah, so that he can go up to the temple and conclude his Nazirut with shaving and bringing the offerings. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Daled. Now, having discussed a Nazir who became tameh at the end of his term, Mishnah Hay teaches the law of a Nazir who is already tameh at the time he makes his vow. Mishna Yomi bebet hakvarot. If someone made a vow to be a Nazir while he was standing in a cemetery where he became tameh by contact with the graves we know are sources of corpse tumah. It says in Bamidbar, chapter 19, verse 16. Even if he stayed in the cemetery for 30 days, the term of a standard Nazir, and observed all the rules of Nazirut in a state of tumah, these days do not count toward the number of days he needs to fulfill his term of Nazirut. Only the days in which a Nazir is in a state of tahara from any corpse-related tumah count toward his term. Nevertheless, his vow did take effect, and he is obligated to keep all the laws of Nazirut wherever he is. He may therefore not drink wine or cut his hair even while in the cemetery. It is only that these days do not count toward his term since he is tameh, as the Gemara explains in Masechet Nazir, page 16b and 17a. Since all the laws of Nazirut apply to him, he must immediately leave the cemetery, and if he is warned to do so and does not, he is subject to lashes. So when the Mishnah says that he remained there for 30 days, it does not mean he may stay in the cemetery. Rather, it means that even if he violated the law and stayed for 30 days, these days do not count toward his term. Therefore, after he leaves the cemetery and purifies himself, he must observe his entire term of Nazirut from the beginning. And even if he then touches a corpse, meaning if after declaring Nazirut he touches a corpse or exposes himself to any of the other corpse-related tumahs listed in chapter 7, Mishnah 2, that cause a Nazir to forfeit his Nazirut and obligate him to shave and bring the offerings for becoming tameh, he does not shave and bring the offerings of tumah. the offerings of a Nazir who became Tameh. The Torah obligates a Nazir to bring them only if he started his Nazirut in a state of Tahara and then became Tameh. Not if he was Tameh when the Nazirut began. And the Gemara on page 18a in Nazir learns this law from a verse in Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 9. Now, although someone who begins his Nazirut in a state of Tumah is not subject to all the rules of a Nazir who became Tameh, once he purifies himself and begins observing the Nazirut in a state of Tahara, he does become subject to all the regular rules, like the Mishnah now teaches. Yatzav Nichnas, if he left the cemetery, purified himself from his Tumah, and started to observe his Nazirut in a state of Tahara, and then he entered the cemetery again, Olin lo mina minyan, the days that he observed in a state of Tahara before he returned to the cemetery, do indeed count toward the number of days he needs to fulfill his term of Nazirut. His re-entrance into the cemetery does not cause him to forfeit these days, because the tomb of a cemetery, while forbidden to a Nazir, does not cause him to forfeit the days already observed. In chapter 7, Mishnah 3, we're going to see corpse-related tumas that, unlike the tumas in chapter 7, Mishnah 2, do not cause a Nazir to shave or forfeit previous days. According to the Rav, the tumah of the graves is one of these. Now, however, the days that he remains in the cemetery, as well as the days that he remains in the state of tumah, even after he leaves the cemetery, do not count toward his term, as the Mishnah taught above, and it will be explained further in chapter 7, Mishnah 3. Umevi koban tumah, and if he becomes tameh now from a corpse, he must shave and bring the offerings of tumah. In addition, he forfeits all the days of his Nazirut, and so must start his term again from the beginning. All the usual rules of a Nazir apply to him once he begins observing his Nazirut in a state of Tahara. So again, it depends on the wording of the Mishnah, how the Rav reads it, but generally, again, we said Yitzav Nichnas, if he left the cemetery and then re-entered the cemetery, Olino min yaminyan, the days do count toward the number of days he needs to fulfill his term. And if he becomes Tameh now from a corpse, he must shave and bring the offerings of Tumah, and in addition, he forfeits all his days of Nazirut and must start his term again from the beginning, because all the usual rules of a Nazir apply to him once he begins observing his Nazirut in a state of Tahara. Now, this ruling implies that as soon as this Nazir purifies himself and begins observing his Nazirut in a state of Tahara, if he again becomes Tameh, he forfeits a day of his Nazirut, even if this happens on the very day he became Tahor. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with this. Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo bo bayom, a Nazir does not forfeit his Nazirut if he becomes Tameh on the same day that he became Tahor and started to observe his Nazirut. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he may count this day as the first day of his Nazirut term, even though he became Tameh from a type of corpse Tumah that normally causes a Nazir to forfeit his term. Therefore, the day he completes his purification and continues his Nazirut, Therefore, the day he completes his purification and continues his Nazirut counts as the second day of his term. Now again, Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo b'vayom, a Nazir does not forfeit his Nazirut if he becomes Tameh on the same day that he became Tahor. Rather, he forfeits his Nazirut only if he became Tameh on the second day or any following day of his term. Shnema, like the verse says in Bamidbar, chapter 6, verse 12, Vayamim arishonim yipelu. If the Nazir becomes Tameh, the first days of his term shall be forfeited. Ad shilo yamim rishonim, the plural form of the word days implies that he does not forfeit his Nazirut unless he has at least 2 days of observance to forfeit. If, however, he became Tameh on the first day and has only 1 day to forfeit, he does not forfeit his Nazirut and the first day counts. The first time, however, argues that the verse uses the plural days to teach that a Nazir who became Tameh does not forfeit only 1 day, but all of the previous days, regardless of the number. Now, the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the first Tana applies not only to the case of this Mishnah, but to any Nazir who becomes Tameh on the first day of his Nazirut term. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he does not forfeit that day, and according to the first Tana, he does. And the Rav does tell us, Rabbi Eliezer, that Rav does follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And that is an Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Shavua Tov. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.